Welcome to the tutorial on how to create a personalized garment using your stick and stitch. Now, the first thing I want to show you is a couple of stitches and a couple of keywords that I'm going to be using throughout the tutorial. And the first one is going to be our starting loop. So you can see here I've drawn a very simple line. Instead of starting at the very top of our line, what we're going to do is we're going to bring our stitch down approximately 1/2 centimetre. We're going to bring our needle up and leave a small tail underneath, which we'll tie off to later. And we're just going to take our needle back down that same hole to create a loop. We're then going to bring our needle back up to our starting point. So this is where your fabric marker starts, or your stick and stitch markings start. And we're just going to hook our loop over and pull through, and then we're just going to anchor that down with a stitch. Now this has now become your starting loop. So when you hear me say we need to do a starting loop, this is what we need to do. Now the stitch we're going to be using for this project is the reverse chain stitch. Now in all my other projects you'll see that I always do a normal chain stitch where I bring my needle down and up again. I'm not going to be using that method for the stick and stitch, and the reason for that is stick and stitch can be quite tough to pierce and it can be a little bit taxing on your fingers. So I find the reverse chain stitch a little bit more user friendly and it's a little bit more gentler on your fingers. So you'll notice here we're going down approximately 1/2 centimetre in space, and we're using the opposite end of the needle to thread through our previous loop. I just find this as a little bit easier when you're working with a sharp needle. And this is pretty much it. We're just going to continue in this pattern all the way until we get to the end. So the next thing I want to show you is how to tie off. And these are all the little things that we want to learn before we start our project so that you're nicely prepared. So we've got our starting tail, and then we've got also our threaded tail still on our needle. So what we're going to do, if your threaded tail is too far away from your starting tail, you're just going to do a whipped back stitch, and we're going to go about 4 or 5 times. And then just for extra security, I like to put just a little knot there, and then we can just snip off our ends, and that is how to tie off. Now let's say our two ends are actually quite close together. We can just continue that whip back stitch all the way until the two ends meet and then tie them together in a triple knot. So again, if you are too far away from your starting tail, just 4 or 5 weaves and a little knot. If you are close to your starting tail, you can whip back stitch all the way through until those two tails meet. Tie them in a triple knot and snip the ends. And once you're finished, this is how the back should look. So let's get underway with your project. If you've got our Pixie&Me DIY kit, you will need your fabric marker. You will also need your sharp stitching needle, whichever colour yarn you've chosen for your project. And some things that are not included is your ruler, and also you will need a pair of scissors as well. I would suggest also cutting around your stick and stitch and having that ready to go. So the first thing we need to do is get our stick and stitch nice and central. Now there are lots of ways that you can do this. I personally like to either count the stitches either side of my letters, or you can use a ruler. Now this does take a little bit of fiddly work, but you have to measure either side so that you've got it equal to both where your letters start and where your letter finishes on your stick and stitch. Now once I'm happy that I've got it somewhat central, I'm just going to use my fabric marker and just put 2 little markings so that when I peel back my stick and stitch, I know where I need to place it. Next, we're just going to peel our stick and stitch off your backing sheet. Now I will be applying a line underneath the name of every stick and stitch. This is just a helpful guide to make sure that your line lines up with the stitches on the jumper. Otherwise it can, without you knowing, go slightly off center. I'm just going to take my ruler again and just double check that we've got even on each side, and I'm happy and ready to go. Now another little tip here that you can use, especially if you are a beginner, is to use your fabric marker and just take the time to measure 1/2 centimetre little dots around your lettering. This is just going to be a lot more useful for you as a guide as you're stitching, and will keep your stitches nice and even. However, this is not essential. It is just more to help if you are finding that your stitches are just not quite even enough. The next thing we're going to do is to thread on approximately 2 meters of our yarn. Now the best way to do this is to pinch between the thumb and the forefinger. It does take a little bit of practice, but once you do it a few times, you'll soon become very quick at it. Now, remembering our guide at the beginning, we're going to do our starting loop. So remember, we're going to come down approximately 1/2 centimeter and do our first starting loop. Now, once our starting loop is finished and you've got your little guide dots there, you can go in now and start your reverse chain stitch. Now, the stick and stitch is a little bit more tougher to go through than if you were stitching without, but just persevere with it. It's a really great tool to use in keeping your lettering just really nice and even. So we're going to go in with our reverse chain stitch. So we're going to pull our yarn through and then just take it back down the same hole. And then we're just going to repeat this process all the way around our letters. Now you're already a pro at this, so we're going to skip ahead and we're going to meet at the top of this N. So once we get to the top, we're just going to bring our needle down and start another starting loop, just like we did at the very beginning. So once we've got our starting loop done, which I've just done here, I've just jumped ahead, then we can just continue with our reverse chain stitch, bringing our stitching down to the bottom section of the N. And again here we have done this again, we've done our starting loop again, and then we can continue going all the way up the letter N. And this is pretty much all you need to know when it comes to stitching your beautiful names. You're going to follow this method with your starting loop and your reverse chain stitch all the way, following your guidelines from your stick and stitch. So now we've finished our capital N, we're just going to finish off that stitch. And then when we flip our garment over, if you remember at the start, we were talking about our starting tail and also our threaded tail. Now these are too far apart, so we're not going to back thread through all of that work again. So I'm going to do the shorter version where I'm going to thread approximately 4 or 5 times, tie one little knot and snip off the ends. Now we've still got our starting tail there and we need to do something with him. So we're just going to put our thread back onto our needle. And here I'm just going to weave through my work again 2 or 3 times, given it's only a small piece of yarn. And then I'll pop a little knot on that and then we're good to go. So once I've snipped off the ends there, and I'm just going to take a look at my work, I can see I've got a few extra ends, which I'm just going to clean up here. And that's what our back is looking like. Now I'm just going to skip ahead here and stitch this O, and I've anchored it down before I go and do my A and my H. I'm just going to snip that off and I'm going to leave that tail there because I'm going to come back to that in a second. I'm going to go ahead and stitch my A and my H now. And then I'm going to show you how we connect these letters together so that it looks a little bit more flush and a little bit more flawless. So the tail that we anchored down before, we're just going to pop that back onto our needle. Then we're going to bring our needle back up through the final chain that we used for our letter. So for the O, we're then going to anchor it into the A, and then do it again with the A into the H. And then when we flip our garment over, again, we'll whip back stitch to find the nearest tail and triple knot together. Once you're happy that all of your ends are tied off neatly, you can then submerge your sweater or your garment into a bowl of lukewarm to cold water. And if you just leave it for a minute or two, you'll see that the stabilizer starts to dissolve. Now, the stabilizer can be a little bit stubborn at times to be removed, so you may need to just help it along a little bit. Just be careful not to damage your stitching and just be really extra gentle with it. Once you've submerged it and you're happy that most of the stabilizer is removed, you can then run your garment underneath a cold or lukewarm tap and wash away the excess. Failing that, I personally just like to put my garment straight into the washing machine on a cold, delicate wash, and it usually comes out absolutely perfect. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I really hope that you have fun making this project for someone special. Happy stitching!